Well, the book is really getting at a paradox about reform over the last 3 decades, the period running from about 1978 to about the financial crisis. And we often think of that period as a period in which democracy was triumphant around the world. Many people will say that. A period in which the idea of self-rule by citizens really got established. But I'm looking at a bundle of reforms that tell a different story. The classic example is a central bank. Around the world over the last 30 years, you saw this revolution in central banking where decisions that used to be made by politicians are now being made by experts working in organizations that are deliberately buffered from the political process. The premise is that central bankers need to have autonomy to make the hard choices that citizens and politicians, it's alleged, won't otherwise make. The argument I make in the book is that logic you see operating in the field of central banking gets replicated in a bundle of different areas. It gets replicated, for example, in the way we think about managing ports and airports, which have to handle this huge boom in global trade, or in the way in which we think about independent regulation of foreign investors. The premise being you have to buffer regulators to reassure investors so that they feel that they'll be treated fairly. Different functions being treated in the same way. If critical pieces of infrastructure being given to private operators and the assumption that you need to get those key components of infrastructure, roads, utilities, bridges, and so on, operating properly. You see the same kind of logic operating, that if a function is critical to the operation of a globalized economy, we have to get it out of ordinary politics. A big part of this was trying to reassure key interests, the interests advantaged by globalization, whether it's foreign investors, lenders, manufacturers, shippers, retailers, and so on. It was exactly about giving them reassurance that the rules of the game would be maintained, that there would be stability in the business environment. Well, it turns out that 2 issues came up. The first was there was, in many countries, ambivalence about the idea of letting experts or technocrats make decisions that had broad ramifications for the community at large. And then the second difficulty was that it turned out sometimes that experts were fallible. They made mistakes. The premise behind delegation of authority to independent central banks was that central bankers would do a better job than the rest of us at making the critical decisions about the management of the economy. But one of the conclusions or findings from the financial crisis was that, experts can be fallible too. They can make mistakes. And one of the intriguing results of the financial crisis has been economists coming out now and saying, well, there was a form of groupthink operating in the central banking community and the professional community that blinded people to the risk of a looming financial crisis. That because of doctrine or whatever reason, they were not attentive to the warning signs that a crisis was coming. I argue that a lot of these reformers were naive in the way they approached reform in the following way. They had this idea. Many of these reformers were in prominent institutions, international institutions, pushing these reforms on governments, telling them you had to do this in order to succeed in a globalized marketplace. But to some degree, their approach to reform was naive. They had this idea that if you adopt a law empowering guardians, delegating authority to experts, then the experts would actually be empowered. And similarly, if they looked at a country and said, well, that country's got a law that says, for example, this group of regulators will operate autonomously, then that must be in fact the case. But it was naive in the sense that it underestimated the capacity of powerful interests to subvert the law, to get in there and manipulate decisions made by experts in their own interests. And it also, I think, was naive in the sense that it underestimated the extent to which citizen groups, advocacy groups, would resist attempts at delegation if they thought it was going to compromise their right to participate in decision-making or other values they thought were important. So the project was delegation to experts. The strategy was this sort of simple idea of legal reform, But in practice, actually delegating authority turned out to be much more difficult than expected. This isn't just a book for academics. This is a book for general readers as well. I've tried to keep it accessible, and I've also tried to illustrate the argument I'm making with lots of stories that illustrate the battle between the desire for discipline, the desire to constrain democratic processes, and all of these stakeholders who are trying to ensure that the public has a right to participate in decisions. But it's also true, a lot of people in the era of globalization were not necessarily making a lot of money. There was winners and losers in the era of economic liberalization. The winners were people like shippers, retailers, investors, lenders, and so on. But there were a lot of people in communities who were bearing the costs of globalization, who were finding, for example, that they were bearing some of the externalities from growth. And one of their frustrations with this idea of delegation was that they sometimes felt that their interests weren't being accommodated as these experts, these guardians, made decisions about the performance of critical functions. There's an intellectual battle, a battle about the ideas that we ought to guide us in thinking about democratic governance. I mean, there's a battle of material interests here, too. People with jobs on the line, with business interests on the line as well. But you know, it becomes in some cases a very hard material, physical battle as well. When you get troops on the street, as you do in some places, then it really is manifest that this is a struggle over the shape of democracy.